There is a book in a museum in Dresden, Germany, and most people walk right past it. It sits behind glass, its bark paper pages folded like an accordion, the colors faded to rust and ash. Tourists glance at it for maybe 4 seconds. A few snap a photo. Then they move on to the next exhibit. It looks like decoration. It looks like something a child might paint. But hidden inside those pages is something that shouldn't exist. Buried in the columns of dots and bars and strange black symbols is a prediction. A specific astronomical event recorded with mathematical precision that would not occur for over 1,000 years after the ink dried. The Maya scribe who painted it never saw it happen. He couldn't have. He calculated it. And the date he locked into that page lands inside our own century. This is the story of the Dresden Codex and the eclipse it should never have been able to see. Let's start with what the object actually is. The Dresden Codex is one of only 4 surviving Maya books in the entire world. 4 out of thousands. The Spanish burned the rest. In July of 1562, a friar named Diego de Landa gathered the sacred books of the Yucatan into a pile and set them on fire because he believed they contained the lies of the devil. He later admitted the Maya were tormented by the loss. Centuries of recorded knowledge turned to smoke in an afternoon. The Dresden Codex survived only because it had already left the Americas. It surfaced in Europe in 1739. Purchased by the Royal Library in Dresden from a private owner in Vienna. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody could read it. It was cataloged as a curiosity from the New World and shelved. For almost 150 years, scholars treated it as art, pretty patterns, religious decoration. They dismissed it as symbolic. They were wrong. Because in the late 19th century, a librarian in Dresden named Ernst Fürstemann began staring at those columns of dots and bars, and he realized he wasn't looking at decoration at all. He was looking at numbers. Here's where it gets strange. The Maya counted in base 20. A dot was 1, a bar was 5, and a shell symbol was 0. That last part matters more than it sounds. The Maya were using a true positional 0 centuries before the concept reached medieval Europe. Not a placeholder, not an approximation, a functioning mathematical 0 woven into a counting system precise enough to track time across thousands of years. Fürstemann decoded page after page, and what emerged was not myth, it was machinery. The Dresden Codex was a working astronomical instrument disguised as a book. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe and turn on the bell. Because what these pages were actually tracking is the part nobody warned you about. Now, let's get back to it. The Maya called the sky a living text. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya, the heavens are described as a place written by the gods, where the movements of light carry meaning. For generations, scholars read that as poetry. The feathered serpent crossing the sky, the hero twins descending into the underworld and rising again. Beautiful stories, spiritual metaphors. But Fürstemann and the Codex specialists who followed him began to suspect those weren't just stories. They were observations. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a record. And the Codex contains 3 clues that prove it. The first clue is the Venus table. Across 6 pages, the Dresden Codex tracks the planet Venus through its cycle. The Maya knew that Venus appears as the morning star, vanishes, then returns as the evening star, on a rhythm of roughly 584 days. The mainstream view long held that this was ritual. Venus was associated with war and with Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, and the Maya watched it for omens. That part is true, but it's incomplete. Because when you check the Codex numbers against modern astronomy, the Maya figure for the Venus cycle is accurate to within 2 hours over the span of a single cycle. They built in a correction factor to keep the table from drifting across centuries. They weren't guessing, they were calibrating. This was not superstition. This was a long-term clock. That's the first clue. The second is the one that turns a calendar into a warning. Deep in the Codex are pages covered in images of a great serpent, its mouth open, with symbols of darkness pouring out. For years, these were read as pure mythology: the sky monster, the devourer, the end of an age. The Maya feared a moment when the sun would be swallowed, and these pages, scholars said, captured that dread in paint. But Firsteman noticed the serpent pages were wrapped in numbers, and the numbers formed a sequence: intervals of 177 days, 148 days. Numbers that astronomers recognize instantly. Those are eclipse intervals, the gaps between the moments when the sun and moon and earth can line up and swallow the light. This is the eclipse table, and it is the heart of the mystery. The Maya could not predict every eclipse. Nobody in the ancient world could see one from a fixed location reliably. What the Maya did instead was more sophisticated than that. They identified the windows. They calculated the precise intervals at which an eclipse becomes possible, and they tracked those windows forward across time, page after page, season after season. The serpent with the open mouth was not a monster. It was a symbol for the node, the point where the moon's path crosses the sun's path and the light can go dark. The Maya were marking danger zones in the sky. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. Then they ran the math, and the math worked. The eclipse table in the Dresden Codex covers a span of around 33 years and tracks roughly 70 eclipse possibilities. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. The table is not anchored to a single date. It is a template, a cycle engine. The Maya designed it to be re-anchored, to be slid forward across centuries by adding the great cycles of their long count calendar. Feed the table forward far enough, and it keeps predicting. It does not expire. The scribe who painted those pages built a machine that could throw its predictions 1,000 years into a future he would never live to see. That brings us to the third clue, and this is the one no one could test until recently: the long count. The Maya did not measure time in years the way we do. They measured it in vast, nested cycles, counting the days since a mythological starting point in the year we call 3114 BC. The long count runs for thousands of years without repeating. It is the backbone that holds the whole codex together, the thread that lets the Venus table and the eclipse table stay synchronized across enormous spans of time. The mainstream reading treated the long count as a ceremonial calendar, a way to date kings and carve monuments. That's part of it. But it's incomplete, because the long count is also what makes the codex predictive. Without it, the eclipse intervals are just numbers. With it, they become a timeline that points forward. And when modern astronomers projected that timeline forward, using the Maya's own intervals and their own correction factors, the windows kept landing on real eclipses. Real ones. Eclipses confirmed by NASA's own ephemeris calculations. The Maya windows from a book painted before the year 1200 still align with eclipse events in the modern era. Not approximately. The intervals hold. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In the 20th and 21st centuries, researchers cross-checked the Dresden Codex against the precise astronomical record. The Venus table matched. The eclipse table matched. And when scholars resolved the long-standing problem of how to convert Maya dates into our own calendar, the correlation that fit best, the one used by astronomers today, made the codex predictions snap into place against verified celestial events. A book of bark paper, painted by hand with no telescope, no clockwork, no written equations as we know them, was carrying eclipse mathematics accurate enough to project across a millennium. And here is where the story darkens. Of the thousands of Maya books that once existed, only 4 survived. The knowledge that produced the Dresden Codex was not the work of one genius. It was the distilled output of centuries of observation, generation after generation, of sky watchers, recording, correcting, refining. All of it was written down, and nearly all of it was destroyed. The eclipse table you can see today is a fragment, a single surviving page from a library that has been erased. We are reading one chapter of a book whose other chapters were burned on purpose. Whatever else the Maya calculated, whatever longer cycles, whatever deeper predictions they tracked, went up in De Landa's fire and was never recovered. The official record has a hole in it the size of a civilization. Now, does this prove the Maya had secret knowledge beyond what any ancient people could achieve? Probably not. Let's slow down and be honest about what we actually have. The Maya were not predicting eclipses by magic. They were doing something more impressive than magic. They were doing patient, multi-generational science. They watched the sky for hundreds of years. They wrote down every event. They found the patterns hidden inside the chaos, the long rhythms that only reveal themselves to people who keep records across lifetimes. The serpent with the open mouth is not proof of aliens or lost technology. It is proof of something rarer. Human minds, with no modern tools, reading the clockwork of the solar system by sheer accumulated attention. But that doesn't make the Codex ordinary. Sit with what it actually means. A culture that the conquerors dismissed as primitive had built a mathematical system with a true zero, tracked Venus to within hours, mapped the eclipse cycle, and encoded all of it into a portable book that still aligns with the sky today. They understood that time was deep, that the heavens ran on cycles longer than any human life, and that those cycles could be captured in numbers and carried forward. They were not worshiping the dark. They were predicting it. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Because the Dresden Codex is what survived by accident. It is the one that slipped out of the Yucatan before the fire reached it. If a single rescued book contains a working eclipse engine that still functions 1,000 years later, what was in the books that burned? What longer predictions, what deeper alignments, what records of the sky stretching back across the classic Maya collapse and beyond were lost in an afternoon of flame? We will never read them. The scribes who could have explained them are gone. The language that held their secrets had to be painstakingly rebuilt from the few pages left behind. The Dresden Codex is still there in Germany, behind its glass. The pages are fragile now, water damaged from the bombing of Dresden in the Second World War. The colors fading a little more with every passing decade. The serpent still opens its mouth. The numbers still hold their intervals. And somewhere in the projection of those intervals, carried forward by the long count, an eclipse window the scribe calculated by candlelight is still waiting to arrive. He recorded a darkness he would never witness. We are the ones living inside the dates he wrote down. And most people will still walk right past it, 4 seconds, a photo, and gone, never knowing they just looked at a 1,000-year prediction made by a hand that turned to dust before the prophecy came true. The book is still there, still folded, still counting. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, watch the next investigation on screen now.